Leaders, how do you know if you're leading your team well? We talk a lot in the business world about leadership, but what does good leadership look like? In this video, Kevin and I will talk unscripted about what good leadership looks like and how to grow your leadership skills, drawing from our own leadership experiences, as well as our work consulting and coaching leaders. We're also going to give you a leadership self-assessment so that you can check in today with how well you're leading your team. You'll walk away from this video with more visibility on how you're leading now, more clarity on your vision for leading in the future, and a few action items that you can use to close those gaps. Let's jump in with the conversation. So, Kevin, I wanted to start off chatting about what leadership is, right? We're going to talk about leadership today and various ways to grow it and practice it. But I think we have to start fundamentally with a definition of what we mean by leadership.
Mhm.
When you think of leadership, what is leadership?
Yeah, it's actually a tough task, I think, to succinctly summarize such a broad topic. And so I'll admit that it's been something that I don't have my own succinct definition on, but there are things there are elements that I think come up a lot. One is I think leadership is I call it mastering co-creation in service of some future state. So you to unpack that, you have some place you're trying to be either sort of physically or in time, or you have some sort of goal, some place that the group hasn't been yet, and you want to take the group there. Then you have to figure out how to get all of these different humans with different backgrounds and different skills to co-create together the things that are necessary to get to that future state. So that's my best attempt at figuring out a succinct definition of leadership. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I agree that leadership is difficult to define. When I was thinking about this, it was more of a subconscious idea that I really had to work to try to get into to words. So it's funny, where I went for a definition of leadership? I went to Wikipedia. And
Okay.
actually, Wikipedia's definition helped me because it said leadership is defined as the ability of an individual, group, or organization to lead, influence, or guide other individuals, teams, or organizations.
Mhm.
And so I think inherent in what we're both talking about is leadership is inherently with other people,
Yeah.
right? You can lead via thoughts by yourself, but really leadership is about the impact and influence you have with others.
Yeah.
It's this interpersonal exercise. And at least for me, that influencing folks to head towards a common direction and work together to get there. When you know you're leading effectively, you see people working together towards a common goal. When folks are nervous or scared or doing things on their own or sort of knifing each other in the background, right? Those are organizations or situations where leadership is maybe less present. So it's almost something you can observe as easily as you can define. What do you
Yeah.
think?
Well, you're making me think of it's sometimes hard to envision leadership in an office setting where we're all sitting around and talking to each other. Like it's not as crystal clear. However, if you thought about dropping your entire team into the jungle and you knew that safety was some there's a building, somewhere, and who's going to be in front guiding the group to get somewhere, that is leadership. And if you're the person that is gravitating towards the front, you have a perspective, you know how to best leverage everyone's strengths to make sure you get there safely. It's easier to visualize for me is this idea of being in a jungle and who's going to be the person in front. Just makes it a lot more crystal clear for me.
It's funny though, when you say that, my coaching training is from the Coactive Training Institute, and they also have a leadership training program and philosophy.
Mhm.
And they articulate that, look, that leading from the front is what we all picture, but there are also other forms of leadership that are leading from aside, leading from behind, because when the leader says something and says, we go this way, if no one goes that way,
Yeah.
right? They sort of don't have any following. So someone who says like, oh yeah, hey, let's go that way. Let's listen to so and so. I think that's a good idea. Those supporters, those champions, the folks who actually take the leadership and help make it happen. I think there's so many different forms of leadership. Leadership from the front is a canonical one, and it is one that I still think is not really done well in most instances when you look at real non-hypotheticals of leadership. But those leaders who say, here's the way we're going to go, the leaders who jump in and say, okay, here's how we're going to get there. The folks who actually say, hey, wait a minute, you're not considering this. Let's
Yeah.
go that way, right? Like it takes a lot of people to make this work. And so I think especially for folks who are in an organization where they don't have formal power, that doesn't mean you can't lead,
Yeah.
but recognizing what part of the almost what part of that you're contributing to, right? Are you setting the direction? Are you setting the implementation? Are you helping make sure the implementation is successful? There are all sorts of different spaces to lead and different contexts to lead in.
Yeah, I think that's great. I don't know where the quote is, but there's some sort of quote around, you can tell if you're truly effective as a leader because the people you're leading at the end of success will say, we did it ourselves. There's some belief of how they were responsible for the outcome, and that shows actually a sign of good leadership as opposed to someone who the leader stands, with a pole at the top of the thing. And the other thing you made me think of is how at some level leadership is about agency, not about any kind of positional power necessarily. And so I think that's how you get all sorts of different dimensions of leadership, because you can be a leader by being an individual contributor who stands up in a meeting and expresses a new thought or a challenging thought, and that itself is an act of leadership, which is different than maybe the classical kind of a group leader kind of framing. But agency, I think, is a key element of leadership.
Well, and I want to ask what you mean by agency. Before we do, I was just watching that movie Conclave. Have you
Yeah,
seen
I
that
haven't.
movie? Okay, so Conclave, there's a scene in the movie where there's some person who's sort of running a discussion, and that person is the de facto leader. But
Mhm.
someone stands up in that discussion and offers a perspective where everyone is like, holy cow, that's the way we should have been thinking of it. You're right. We're all sort of being petty here, etc. And so even that person just standing up with no formal leadership power and saying that thing that everyone's like, oh, right? That influence on other people that we can have, even with our words or our perspectives. We may not have the formal authority or be the person at the head of the room, but we can also lead through that.
Yeah.
You mentioned agency as a key component of leadership. What do you mean by agency?
Uh, I like to think of it as being an agent in the world, which itself doesn't help as a definition of agency, but recognizing that you can self-author your own perspective and thoughts and move somewhere. And so I think a lack of agency would be felt like a little bit of learned helplessness, or like, maybe even some victim mindset where you don't feel like you can move until someone grants you permission to move somewhere, whereas an agent recognizes their ability to move themselves. I am a fully formed human, and I can have my own thoughts, and I can move where I want to go. And that's sort of a sense of agency, is that recognizing that you are your own source of power, I guess, and able to make decisions and move throughout the world, which itself is I think, not to get too much into like forms of mind or some of the other related thoughts of leadership, but that is a learned skill, a learned perspective. It's something that all of us coming in. Let's say that we have parents, and those parents are our guides. We're not really agentic in that sense because we have someone telling us how to think and what to do, and kind of the norms and behaviors. And if we're lucky, I guess I'll frame it that way. Some of us can move to where we recognize our agency in the world, but it is not a natural. We're not given that at birth. Like we don't come out feeling agentic. It's sort of something you have to evolve into, for lack of a better term. What do you think about?
Yeah. Well, and it's so interesting. As you're talking about this, I don't have a formal structure around it, but almost a continuum is coming to mind from the victim mindset, which is things outside me are happening. I have no way to influence them. I'm going to go inwards. I'm going to get cynical or blame. I'm going to just let the world happen because the world happens. I would say then there's almost the dependent mindset, which is okay, other folks are making the decisions. I might have a little influence, right? Like if we think of a 13-year-old who's trying to influence their parents, right? They still may not have a lot of the agency or control, but they have a voice, right? And so a dependent might say, I don't own this, but I can influence it, where a victim doesn't think they can influence it.
Yeah.
Beyond that, I would say then there's the agent for yourself, right? I own the choices in my life. I can achieve goals, even in the face of hardship when things come my way. I can find a way to navigate out of them. So there's that responsibility and ownership.
Yep.
And I would put leadership agency as a step beyond that, which is we own this. Like, how do I get an outcome for us instead of just how do I get an outcome for me, which is a great thing to consider, right? Coming from that victim mindset, the how do I take responsibility for this entire organization and say that even that these things outside of my control are my responsibility, there's growth and responsibility along the
Yep.
continuum I outlined, and growth and agency to impact the outcomes for those around us. I don't know, how
Yeah.
does that continuum sound? What's
Well,
that voice?
I was processing it while you're thinking, and I think I'm with you. One, I love the drama triangle as a framework for thinking about how people react. And so you're mentioning a lot of those things. I think those are very relevant and important. Then there's also sort of the forms of mind, adult development theory you're talking about a little bit, where, people start off, I think self-important is one of the ways it's framed. Then you get into a socialized form of mind, which means you're taking a lot of input from those around you. And then the third phase is the self-authored, where you're building your own values and perspective, and that is agency. And then to your point, the last point, I was thinking that's difficult, and there's probably like horizons of agency is maybe how I'm thinking about what you said is, you can come to recognize your ability to be an agent for yourself. Then maybe you could extend it. Let's say that you're a parent, you could extend that into your family system. Maybe then you could extend it into a small team. Eventually, as a CEO of a large company, you're thinking about your entire tens of thousands of folks. You're thinking about the market. There's sort of horizons of agency is maybe what you're making me think of. Does that resonate with the point you were making?
Absolutely. Well, and for me, it helps me remember some of the parts of leadership that I enjoyed, right? When I was leading groups of people directly in an organization, where it was, okay, what if I could influence the outcome out here, right? Influence this big end goal, and all these people sort of stretching the frontiers of that is really fun, at least for me, as a challenge, right? Like, how far could this go? And I've worked with leaders as clients where it's like, okay, you did this with 20 people. What about 40? What about 80? And
Yep.
so that sort of question of how far can you help orchestrate and conduct and inspire and all those things that leaders do, once we give ourselves permission to have agency for ourselves,
Yep.
and then that influence outwards, the question of what might be possible if we could influence more broadly is fun. And then there are challenges at every level, right? Of course, it's not easy, but there
Yep.
is an opportunity to create greater impact when you have more hands on deck. And I think
Yep.
that can be really exciting.
Yeah. There's a question that I like to teach people and ask of myself, which can break you out of any kind of victimhood and think about agency. The question is, how am I complicit in creating the conditions I say that I don't like? So that you recognize sources of power or optionality. And so that's a really good question that ties into when I think about these horizons of agency and these ever expanding spans of control, or whatever term we might want to use. It makes me think of another key skill, not to necessarily pivot us into a new line of thinking, but around systems thinking and system architecture and organizational systems. Because even if you have the mindset that tells you that you can think about a bigger horizon of agency, you may not yet have the skill to be able to design a system in which a system of that size can produce a good outcome. And so that is one of the skills of leadership, is to develop that capability around systems thinking and system coordination. Because another good term I like is around how good people working in a bad system create bad outcomes. And so as a leader, you can have amazing people, but if you have designed an organizational system that prevents them from doing good outcomes, and there's a lot of research around that, you're never going to get, the most that you want, either the human flourishing that you want or the outcome you want. And so I think systems thinking and systems architecture is a really important skill to support your horizon.
And so tell me more what you mean by systems thinking, because I think you had some examples of how it plays out, but really spelling out what you mean there, and then how you develop that, or how you've seen people grow that if they don't naturally have that talent.
Yep. Well, I'll just mention there are two books that I love around this. The first is The Fifth Discipline by Peter Senge, if I'm saying his name correctly. And then the second book is called Thinking in Systems. And I don't remember the name, maybe Donna Meadows, but you could look up those two titles. Both of those have really interesting examples that go into very specifically, I think, Fifth Discipline talks about a beer distribution game, and you have many different agents in a string trying to supply beer, to a bar. And here's how the feedback loops work. And, they go through like, here's just how the math works for when you have a lag between these two things and when you can only do this. It's just there's a natural oscillation that starts to occur and things go haywire. And they've done so many different I guess, play acting with people where they tell them, okay, you're going to be this person in this story. And okay, your job is to do the best you can here. And everyone's trying to optimize an outcome. The system just gets in their way. Thinking in systems is a similar one, but I think that one is a car dealership, kind of example. But it's just so funny as a sciencey, mathy, engineering person to watch how the nature of the system produces those oscillations. So those are just good things to look at to sort of to convince yourself that it's true, the extent to which you believe that these are systems that are operating this way. That gives you some of the language to understand systems. You can think about feedback loops. You can think about what do they call it? Things that resist infinite growth. Nothing can grow to infinity. So there's things that put pressure on it. There's just a good vocabulary around it. As far as a leader, how you develop it, one is to be aware that there is a system. And so you have to turn on those lenses to observe your team in that way. What are the inputs? What are the outputs? What are the processes? What are the metrics? What are the incentives? That just kind of gets you to start paying attention. From there, you start to learn what you're trying to optimize for. I know we talked about that before, and I like to optimize for minimizing internal friction is one way that you can think about it. And you kind of look at what's preventing people from doing their best work, and then you start to figure out a different way to run that system. So can you improve a process? Can you reduce a policy? Can you increase the staffing? There's so many different levers you could pull, but just coming, I guess, to sum up my own thoughts, becoming aware and conversant in the vocabulary of systems thinking is a really good grounding mechanism. The second is to start observing your own systems at play and to see how outcomes are caused by the system design. Then you get to start tweaking and experimenting with different things to see if you can produce a different outcome on the system with the same people. But what are your thoughts? That was a lot of information there, Tori.
It was a lot of information, but it's funny, the example that came to me as you were describing the system and system thinking, there was this one faculty member in my graduate program, and we would laugh because he always asked the same question. And his question was, what's your model? And when someone was coming in with an experiment or a test, et cetera, he'd say, what's your model? And what he meant by model, which we weren't always sure, but what he meant by model was almost a diagram of like, okay, here are the things that influence each other. Here's this hypothesis, here's this assumption, here's this outcome. And it was basically stepping back and diagramming it out so that you could situate whatever you were doing in the bigger picture and maybe the bigger hypothesis of the world that you were asserting. And I think many times graduate students come in and they're just taking the next follow-up experiment, et cetera. I think this happens for new grads as well, right? They're just helping with a project, but actually asking folks to step back and say, what's the model you're working with?
Yeah.
I think the more and more complex the model you're able to mentally wrangle with, the better you can see these systems and then say, okay, what are the assumptions here? What are the levers we can pull to test those assumptions? What are the metrics that will tell us if those assumptions are actually true, if the levers we're pulling are actually doing anything? And there really is, the thing that I will say when we're talking about this requires you as a leader to step out of the day-to-day of your work.
Yes.
Which can be hard, right? You can get into the cycle of just, how do I do the next thing? How do I get through this meeting? How do I make the next sale? How do I deliver the next KPI, right? Like there's a lot of pressure.
Yes.
But if you can give yourself time to just step back and look at this stuff, your opportunity for understanding, informed perspective, and pulling, the levers that matter is huge. But I don't know that everyone gives themselves the opportunity to step back and think this way, if I'm honest.
No, yeah, for sure. And I can, speaking from experience, if you're in an environment that again, the systems can defeat, good people, and you end up in a meeting for 10 to 12 hours a day. None of that is stepping back to architect or rethink or observe how your business is running. And that's how you run off a cliff, because you were in it doing the work and not seeing that you were not getting ahead of things. So again, for leadership, being able to see across a longer horizon and ensure that you're building your way to surmount any obstacles that are in the future. And you're right, leaders often get so busy in the day to day for many reasons, but that itself could be a clue that you're in sort of a danger zone. Like you could absorb a single day of 10 hours of meetings is probably fine. You may not enjoy it physically, but your business is going to be okay. If you're doing that for a week, a month, a quarter, a year, the longer that takes, the more risk you're taking. And again, everything's fine until it's not. It's fine until you realize you're not robust to some sort of externality. And then all of a sudden, you just don't have the system to respond and things go haywire. So that's a really good clue.
It's funny too. I realized that, as you're talking about this, I think maybe because of my scientific training or just seeing this, I was the pain in the butt person in corporate who would sort of say, why are we doing this? Why are we doing this way? Like, what's the reason? What's the context, right? And I think those whys often do get you, right? Be like, what is the system we believe is happening? Why are we doing this? What are we testing? What are the beliefs, right? But I think the funniest way you can, the maybe most annoying way you can assess this is just, well, why is it this way? Why do
Yeah.
we do it this way? Why do we do this thing? Why is this important?
Yeah, but I think those are great because I don't know about your experience, but often a growing company will bring in leaders from other companies, and then leaders from other companies come in and they try to apply the same playbook that they used in their prior company. And I think to your point, they're applying tactics that are disconnected from the model or the system in which they're working. And so just the tactic may not apply here, and so that's why it goes back to being really grounded in the modeling, in the frameworks, in systems thinking, so that you can assess whether that playbook actually would apply here and would be successful. Otherwise, you're just kind of throwing spaghetti at the wall, as the saying goes, and seeing what sticks, which I guess is a strategy, but often leaders can come into a new company and fail, and because they're wasting too much time applying the wrong techniques against a system that won't absorb those well.
Well, and it's funny as you're speaking to that, I was thinking before we hopped on the call about leadership skills and what some key leadership skills are. And as you're talking about these examples where folks might be using a playbook from a prior company in a new company, I think two skills come to mind. One is self-awareness, and I'm sure we'll talk about that because that's huge for leaders. But the other I want to call out first is I call it reading the room.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And really sensing, okay, what is this environment I'm operating in? What matters to people here? What's working? What's not working? I worked with a mid-level manager who was often working to speak up in meetings, and she felt like her words weren't landing, and she felt like she needed to work on her brevity and communication, which
Mm-hmm.
of course was true, but there was also an issue of, okay, but are you saying things that are relevant to where the conversation is?
Mm-hmm.
Are you understanding people's motivations such that you can put a perspective out that is closer to where they are instead of all the way over here? Because if you're not reading the room, if you're expressing a perspective far from where people are, doesn't matter how eloquently or concisely you put it, it's going to fall on deaf ears. And so leadership isn't sort of dragging people across to your point of view. It's tracking where folks are and then saying, how might we move this by 10%? How might we reframe this? How might we grow this a little bit? But you have to read the room in order to be able to do that effectively. What do you
Yeah.
think?
Well, I'm just laughing about all the times in my life where I haven't done that well. And it is a skill. And one, I agree with you. I will say that. Like I wrote down awareness while you were saying, because I was like, that was on my mind as well. And then with reading the room, my example, or what it makes me think of, it's sort of thematic, is I'm a very I try to be a very rational person. I'm swayed by data. I'm swayed by the systems thinking. But I've become much more aware, I think in part from these failures, the extent to which emotions and cognitive biases play into how the general people in general make decisions. And of course, I'm subject to them as well. But just because you have information doesn't mean that everyone is going to be swayed by information, or come to the same conclusions you might from information. And I think that's part of this reading the room is, incentives matter, and someone might have different incentives than you. And so that should be a layer in which you're sort of interrogating how the room is processing whatever's being discussed. There's also just watching for people's emotions and body language. And sometimes someone just might not be in the mood to listen today because you can just tell they're stressed, or something's going on at home. And so those are all those different layers, I think, that kind of tie into reading the room. And it's a very artful skill and something that develops a lot over time, but for sure agree with you.
It's interesting, as you were talking, I was thinking of one of my other points. It occurred to me is this understanding what motivates other people.
Mhm.
So we both have to know that things motivate us, but they're not the same as the things that motivate others. And once we have a few categories of motives, we can often look at other folks and say, what's motivating them? When I worked at Google, I had sort of a working system around this because a lot of people at Google are motivated by getting ahead, getting promoted, right? So success, ego, those are common motivators there. And so it then became easier to frame win-win situations once I recognized that, right? How can this get you ahead was an easy way to influence. And
Yep.
it's funny, I think I developed that through working, and I had a few flexibilities there. Some folks were just motivated by something that was really cool and fun to build and like curious, right? There were different motivations. And it's funny, I now find myself reading all these CIA, reports, public things that they say about influencing others and building rapport with others. Of course, they use those tactics for different aims, but
Mhm.
this idea they have of the core motivators being mice, so they have money, ideology, coercion, and ego. They
Mhm.
actually call out that coercion is the least effective, but
Mhm.
that if you tie things to those other areas, right, to money or success, I would say also, to ideology, to ego, if you understand that people's motivations come there, you can read the room and you can look for those win-win situations much more readily than if it's sort of a black box or if you're assuming that other people are motivated by the same things that you are.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. Trying to decide if I have anything to add to that because I had a thought and it was around yeah, we all think everyone's thinking about us as much as we think about us because we walk around just constantly in our head, and we're, of course, the heroes in our own story. But then you recognize that every single other person is also the hero of their own story. And if you can better understand their direction they're trying to head, to your point, what motivates them, you can kind of, I'll say, judo the room into, like, you kind of take their motivation and you find that maybe it's a compromise, maybe it's an adjustment, but it's or a way to frame your argument in a way that resonates with what matters to them, and kind of get to where you're getting to the end goal.
I like that, judoing the room. Well, and so we're talking about a couple of skills that empower leaders, right? That systems thinking, reading the room, understanding what motivates people. What else have you observed, Kevin? What have you observed are leadership skills that can empower leaders or slow them down if they don't have those skills?
But the skill I'm thinking of is related to what we were just talking about, which is kind of being able to work backwards to assumptions. And so, to the point of not being able to influence based on data, often that's because you might not even be aware of all the assumptions you're bringing to your own conclusion. And if you can become more aware of your own assumptions, then you start recognizing that other people have those. And you might need to take a disagreement on the surface, take it a few layers back to some root assumptions. Then you can kind of interrogate each other's and say, oh, wait, okay, your assumption is A versus B. If you switched it and said B versus A, do we now agree? And often you do, because a lot of people are rational, and you're really just trying to adjust the model to our earlier point of how people are thinking about things and get to those assumptions, and then you can have a more meaningful discussion because you're no longer arguing about the wrong thing. You're getting to the root, and so now you can debate which assumption is more likely to be true, and then you can get somewhere really productive. So the skill of being able to work backwards to assumptions, I think, is important.
Absolutely, right? That skill of working backwards to assumptions matters a lot. It's funny as you're talking about it, in my coaching training, we have this idea of doing and being,
Mhm.
right? What are the things you're doing? How are you being when you're doing them? And
Yep.
as you're talking, I'm realizing a couple of ways of being that I might assert matter for leaders, but I'm curious what you think about it. Being curious,
Mhm.
right? That curiosity to go say, okay, what's going on here? What are you motivated by? There's curiosity there.
Mhm.
There's openness, right? A sense of, I may not have all the answers. I may be wrong. Let me try to figure out what's out there, the openness and the humility that goes with it. The other one, and I couldn't really put this into a way of being, it's more an approach, is almost being in dialogue, right?
Mhm.
Being in dialogue with the folks around you, having those open lines of communication. I've seen leaders who put themselves off on an island without that dialogue, and their ability to influence is limited, both because they don't have strong rapport or strong knowledge of what's happening. And so I think that connectedness, that dialogue, as well as the curiosity and openness can be ways of being that serve a leader. I'm not sure if they serve folks in every situation, though I would think if you have a non-curious leader, it's going to be a little challenging anywhere. But they're almost dials that can be turned depending on the leadership challenge or situation you're in. What do you think?
Yeah, well, I'm processing some of what you're saying, and I think what it's made me think of is that for all my talk about systems, et cetera, you're working with another human, and humans cooperate based on relationships. And a lot of what you said to me sound like great ways to create a positive relationship with another human and making sure that they felt seen and heard. Because as a leader, the one of the bigger challenges is you're working in a complex, nonlinear, uncertain environment. It isn't a math problem, and everyone's debating whether 2 + 2 = 4 or not. It's back to those assumptions and the models and probabilistic thinking, and there's so many different ways people could proceed. And as a leader, you're in theory endowed by an organization with certain decision-making authority, either implicit or explicit. And your team may have different perspectives. And you need to have the humility to know that you may not have all the answers, and to create an environment in which you're going to get the best out of the full group's knowledge by being curious, being open, engaging in dialogue, showing someone that even if you don't ultimately agree with their assessment, assumption, decision, that it was a factor in your own process. Whereas if you didn't have any of these, you would be a really disembodied, disempowering, whatever the word is, leader, and that would hinder the relationship, and it makes things much harder to do over time.
And so I think what we're distilling is that a key skill of leadership is relationship building or rapport building.
Yeah.
Right. And it's
Yeah.
funny, that then makes me think of this book I was reading called The Speed of Trust by Stephen Covey. Great book, I would recommend it. And he's talking about, he has this great little equation where it's like, okay, if your organization has low trust, it's going to increase the cost of everything you do and decrease the speed. Where
Yes.
if you can increase speed, you can get things done for lower cost at a faster pace. And so it's a simple little equation, but this notion that the rapport you have between people on your team and that you've built with people on your team
Yeah.
can allow you to do things more quickly, more effectively. I think folks don't always recognize the degree to which the rapport and
Yeah.
those dynamics impact the end results. But at core, a leader of a human organization, maybe once we're all leading AI, this will look a little different. But for as long, actually, I don't know that we're going to be the leaders there. So, but as long as you're leading other people, understanding people, building relationships with people, your leadership will be muted without those things.
Yeah, well, you just make me think of, a leadership team of my own that was very effective is partly because we'd worked together for years, and you understand everyone's motivation. You have through your actions over the years, because there's different dimensions of trust. Like people can trust your competence, they can trust your sincerity, they can trust, these other dimensions, and they all kind of come together to, your overall trust of a person. And there's a lot that is allowed to be left unsaid once you have gotten to a certain level of trust. And that in and of itself makes things go faster, because you're not having to pause, interrogate, have someone explain their thought process, all those things. And then people were much more willing to enact a decision because there was trust in how that decision was reached. Because, especially, so I was at Atlassian, and one of the values is around, open company, no bullshit, and, be the change you see. There's a lot of things that in practice meant people felt very comfortable challenging decisions they didn't understand, which I think is good because it forces the decision to be a well understood and well communicated decision. But at the same time, when it wasn't, it slowed things down immensely. So that just made me think of how I've seen that in practice, everything you're saying.
Right. And that when you have that trust with one another, when you have the trust of the people in your organization, they'll front you some of the rationale without needing to hear all of it, because, hey, you've made good decisions in the past. I trust that you're making a thoughtful decision now. I don't know if I would have made the same decision, or I don't know the full context, but I trust your decision. I was seeing Jeff Bezos talk about this in a disagree and commit video, right? Where it
Yeah.
was almost, okay, I'm going to let you run with that. It's
Yep.
not the decision I would have come to, and I don't know if we're at truth here, but I'm going to trust you to go with that, and then we're going to talk about what happens as a result. And so that trust, that capacity to let others run with things has to be built, has to be earned. I would argue that first it's extended and then sort of tested, right? But that trust allows folks to work together more effectively in
Yeah.
the
Well, I wrote down decisions earlier because I think it's a skill of leadership around making decisions. There's a lot of work around this, and I've seen a couple of things get in people's way. One is not even being clear on how you're making a decision, because there's actually many different ways. You could be the leader decides with no input, and maybe a bad way generally, but maybe a good way if there's a certain challenge that you just have to make it now. You can make a leader decides with input. You could say the team decides. You could say we're going to do a straight, kind of vote. We're going to find a consensus. All those are different ways. And often what happens is everyone's coming into the room making an assumption about the way in which you're making a decision. And if you're not clear on your decision rights, just even by yourself, and if you don't communicate them, that causes a lot of that tension, the consternation, the issues where someone thought you were going to ask the team to decide, but really you were just getting input so you could decide. And when you make that decision alone, then people say, what the hell? So I think decision science is really important in decision rights. And then the other thing that gets people's way is, especially in a bigger company, the incentives are really muted. You're often very disconnected from the customer, and you kind of mistake what is it, outcomes for outputs, and what feels like work becomes the work. And if everyone's busy talking about a decision that feels productive because you're really trying to get to the right answer, but it's extremely expensive in order to do that, and often people over labor over these really minute decisions, and they really are protective of delegating decisions down to where the kind of, I like to think about moving authority to information. So where do people have the right information? Let them decide. That gets really wound up in bigger companies, and so being aware of that as a leader around decisions. Those are some of my big thoughts on decisions. What do you think?
I'll reflect back a few things I heard there. So I heard, how are we making decisions? Who's making decisions? Are we spending time on the most important decisions, or are we spending a lot of time on the ones that don't matter? The other thing I'll say, and I apologize if I've mentioned this leader before, some leaders don't make decisions. Some
Mhm.
leaders punt. And so
Mhm.
there's indecision as well. I was in one org where even the org structure was always interim. You're an
Mhm.
interim manager, you're an interim director. And
Yeah.
that was because she wanted the opportunity to flex at any given point based on what she was hearing from her leadership. And this was an org of like 400 people,
Yeah.
right? We're not talking like leaving a SWAT team of 10, we're talking leaving a SWAT team of 400. And so that indecision kept people constantly unclear on who's doing what matters most, who owns what. And it meant a lot of knives were out, right? Because then folks were competing over
Yeah.
that stuff. And so
Yeah.
recognizing that sometimes indecision comes with more cost than a bad decision. Because
Yep.
at least with a
100%.
bad decision, you'll usually get data on what didn't work
Yeah.
and you can follow up. These indecision, and I think you especially find this in political cultures,
Yep.
because if the culture is hyper political and you say something that upsets someone, that might have ramifications for you. So you decide, well, I'll just give a non-committal answer, sort of like the politicians do in debates. And so that type of culture can lead to no decisions,
Yes.
which comes with its own set of consequences.
Yeah, I would just to reflect on that. One, now that I'm out here on my own independent, I'm getting access to a lot more leaders, and I'm getting a lot more data points on different ways to make decisions. And I've seen a lot of what you're saying now that I'm working with smaller companies. I think partly they haven't gone through the crucible that a bigger company can create to see what it's like and the costs of these decisions. But I've seen people decide, like, essentially leave a meeting saying, you know what? I'm going to think about this for another 3 days. I'm not ready to make a decision. Meanwhile, the decision we're baiting is extremely inconsequential. There's more cost in time and delay than in, to your point, making a wrong decision. Let's say that you choose the wrong option. Well, it's a two-way door, to use Jeff Bezos's framing. You could just turn right around, walk right back, and that's less expensive. And so I've seen the cost of that indecision. And then the other thing I wanted to mention was I really learned over my career the importance of momentum, and how momentum is a very powerful force, just like in physics. So if you've got, let's say that your team is 100 people and they're moving very quickly in a direction, that can be amazing, assuming you're pointed in the right direction. And you can get yourself really into trouble if you're actually like, well, hold on, I'm not quite sure this is the most optimal decision. So everyone just hang out for a moment and wait while I or my leadership team decides and we'll get back to you. Well, leaders are often busy on multiple things, so your decision speed is going to be pretty slow. Meanwhile, you have this person that was unlocked in theory on a direction. Now they're idle for a week. They'll probably do their best to be productive, but they've lost their momentum. And I really try to be mindful of momentum. And it's even when I'm meeting with someone and we're debating a path to go down. Let's say I had a really strong opinion about where I think the team should go next, but the team is telling me they think they should go a different direction. My job in that moment is not to, like, certainly I'll try to inform or educate or whatever the context requires so that at least they have the information. But if they're excited, they're going to go so much faster than if they kind of, politely commit to the thing that I'm telling them they need to do because I know that it's better. That you've lost all the momentum. And so I really am mindful of momentum. And if someone says they're excited about something, oh my gosh, please go do that, even if maybe it's a suboptimal decision.
It's funny, as you talk about momentum, I'm thinking back to the skill of reading the room. And a metaphor that comes to mind of momentum is almost like a river, right?
Mhm.
A river that's flowing with a current. And as a leader, you want to check where you want to direct that river, where it's worthwhile putting up a block or setting up a canal, right? Knowing that the river will flow by itself. If it's headed in a totally crazy direction, right? Like, do you want to create something that tries to left turn a really strong flowing river, right? Might you put a couple of guide rails in place as everyone tumbling over a waterfall, right? Your ability to sort of read that and figure out, where am I putting guide rails?
Yeah.
If I'm putting a big block in there that says, hey, you need to wait for us before you move forward, how much pressure are you creating against that block that you've created? And so really being thoughtful about where you're inserting yourself and how you're building those systems that guide the momentum to the places you want to go. Because, we're talking about these decisions and how certain decisions you want to just accelerate and not think about. Some you don't, like, say, compensation and incentives, right? That's something that if you're changing that every single day, your employees are going to lose a lot of faith in, hey, what are they doing here? How are they paying us? You're going to create so much anxiety around that. All your momentum around projects may start to stop. And so realizing, what are these decisions where we need a little bit slower of an approach versus we need to delegate it away versus we can make it quickly. I think it's important to almost triage and titrate those decisions and then be aware of when they accelerate momentum, when they redirect it, when they completely halt it.
Yes. I love your river analogy because it reminded me when we talked earlier about agency. And let's say that all of your water molecules were agents and they got stopped for some reason. Well, all of a sudden you've got a lake and not a river. And that's not the outcome you wanted. And so it made me think of, one of these elements of organizational architecture is one, pointing people in the right direction so they can build momentum towards where you think they need to go, but then also creating an environment that's sort of self-correcting. So if the water molecules in this tortured example like stopped and wanted to create a lake, then they can self-organize around the way in which to go because you have created an environment that failures are okay, people have agency, just because maybe 2 weeks ago you said go in this direction. Well, they went that direction and they reached an obstacle that none of you envisioned. You want them to be able to go around that obstacle as opposed to saying, hey, everybody, chill out. We've got to somehow send a message back, to the boss who's going to redecide for us. That's awful for the sort of productive capacity and the human flourishing. So thinking about self-correcting. But then the second point would be information architecture as a leader. One of the hardest things as a leader when your org gets big enough is you don't know what's going on. You have people maybe that are across the other side of the globe working an entire day, and their weeks could go by before you might know what's going on. So thinking about information architecture so that you understand where all the rivers are moving and you can kind of get a sense of whether things got off the rails. Because back to assumptions, maybe the self-organizing water molecules went a certain direction around the obstacle. That could have been the wrong decision. They just didn't have context to the bigger ecosystem. They might be channeling their way off a cliff, and we don't want a waterfall there. So like you have to be able to understand what's going on so that you can adjust or give people the context that might be missing. So you want, yeah, self-correcting and a good information architecture so you know where assumptions might be off.
Well, I'm curious on this point of information architecture, because I think as a leader, you have to consider, how am I getting information?
Mhm.
Where's my information coming from?
Yep.
Is it the quality I need? What are the recommendations you have for folks around setting up a productive information architecture?
Oh, let me think. Well, one is to, what do you care about? I think is one thing. So you, well, let me two thoughts. One, I'll just say it so I get off my mind. One, this is important who you hire into your team, because you want people to have the characteristics matter to you. You want to inculcate the org with, how we should make decisions so that everyone, so let's say that that's true. Then in my perspective, you should care more about the outcome than the process. And what I mean is, if you don't, then you're going to need a lot more information, because everyone's going to have to tell you how they're going to achieve a certain goal so that you can review and assess and make recommendations. But I think in general, if you're hiring well for characteristics, you've got intelligent, capable people, like more often than not, they're going to make good decisions about how they approach something, and they'll know when to signal something back. Like they'll know, oh, okay, we really need to talk with someone about this. It'll sort back to self-correcting. Like that'll be fine, and you'll be pushed information when you need it. Instead, if you just care about the outcomes, maybe as defined by a certain metric and their guardrails, that's all you need to know. And so that makes it information flow is much faster if that's true, because partly metrics travel quickly in the sense that they're like a highly dense information construct. And if you've built a really good BI ecosystem, you can sort of self-diagnose anything that you care about. Whereas if a team is communicating their methodology, that takes so much more time. The team, I know from experience, is going to spend probably 10x more time than, let's say you have a meeting for an hour. They're going to spend at least 10 hours. And you might have 10 people for 10 hours prepping for the 1 hour with you. And you think it's just an hour discussion, but they spent 100 hours of time prepping for that. It's expensive to think through, how do we communicate this? So in and of itself, that becomes expensive. So this was like me thinking out loud, but I guess to go back and summarize, one, you want to, I think, care more about the outcomes than the methodology. And then you want to have a fast flowing information system, which usually lends itself to be more metric driven than it does to be procedural. And that'll be a good way to approach it. I don't know. What are your thoughts on that, since that was sort of me thinking on the spot?
Well, and I agree with you. I think the outcomes instead of the methods, I would call that focusing on the what's instead of the hows, right? Delegating the how and setting a clear what. And then the second one you said, I totally forgot, but I agreed with it as well. Because I wanted to go back to the what's, I think even the way sorry, what was the second one you
No,
said?
now you're making me think about what did I say?
Okay, the what's in the house. So I think even in the way you gather information on the what's, there is room to optimize. For example, I often work with leaders, as they level up on, you used to have a bunch of one-on-ones, but now you just don't have time for one-on-ones. How do you structure that one meeting a week with your directs to get the information you need on the what's you've specified? Maybe it's a review of metrics. Maybe folks are coming to you, bringing you a state of the state, but you have to define what that looks like so that you can get the information you need to
Yes.
slightly course correct if need be, without panicking anyone, but without letting things go untended longer than they need to. And so I think figuring out that balance of what information do I need at what granularity from which people who I trust, in what way, I do think there's a lot of learning for each leader, right? And each situation. Where is the team at? Where can I tolerate some failure? Where do I really need things to go right? Designing your information flow based on what works for you and what your org needs at that time. I don't think there's a one size fits all solution there.
Yes. Well, you're making me think of something we used back in the day was around, like I would struggle with these business reviews and the information was coming. I mean, honestly, I just had to squint my eyebrows and my brain was working so hard to figure out like what was I being told? Because again, if your org is big enough, the hundred and some people are going to produce a lot more information and be doing a lot more things than you can reasonably keep in your brain. And so you have to work really hard to kind of understand the context that, this group that may be living it day to day really understands. But this framing, and I'm going to collect this in this idea of how you train and teach people how to communicate effectively can have outsized returns. And one way to think about it is synthesis, but even that is hard for people to understand. What do you mean? I am synthesizing information. But what happens sometimes is people, it's almost like a bad AI before we had AI was you would take a really complex set of information and in trying to synthesize that into something succinct, it lost all meaning. And it's where you get the business jargony stuff. And the immediate next step is to go expand on it to figure out what it meant. And that is a lot of time lost. The thing that really unlocked it for me is I had a coach who framed it in around, you're in the party planning business. And, if if your team is telling you, we don't have enough eggs, we sent so-and-so to the store to get flour, etc. Your brain as a leader is trying to essentially say, and thus, what is the conclusion of all of this? And if you instead can teach people to do that, where I would say instead, like if you told your boss, hey, we're having the party on the 13th as planned. However, we're missing two of the favors. The cake is going to be a little dry and we misspelled their name. You can work with that as a leader, even if you don't know all the details. You could say, oh, the name isn't that important. They're very relaxed about that. For the dryness, could we try this other thing? It's just so much easier to engage at that level of conversation. And so that synthesis and thinking about, am I communicating the ingredients or am I communicating the impact to the final outcome is a much easier way to communicate.
It's so funny, Kevin, because as I listen to that, I think about the skill, which I think most often gets folks promoted in a large organization. And in my head, I've always wondered, is this really a leadership skill or a followership skill? Because I think the skill is that synthesis.
Mhm.
It's that managing up. It's that ability to take the information, distill it in a way that the higher level person can make use of it. And as you do that, the higher level person says, great, you are my information source. I'm now going to promote you so that you're one of my direct information sources.
Yep.
And so one of the things you can do as an IC, if you want to move up in the org, is learn how to up level your communication there. But it's interesting because I do think it's almost, if you're in the middle, I think it's as much a followership skill as a leadership skill, because it's let me tell you what's going on as clearly as possible with the problems that arise. And so you want to look for folks who can communicate that clearly. And as someone in the middle who's maybe leading some people but following others, that communication, that distillation from that middle point is hugely useful.
Yeah, I'm 100% with you. And I do think it's both because to be a good leader, it's being a good follower helps. Being able to understand what someone needs to do and what they're going to do with the information just helps you package it in a much better way. And I was thinking about the bi-directional benefit of this skill. And I think to your point, when you're communicating up, let's say, by packaging the information in a really good way, makes you so valuable because again, like the me in that case is not going to be squinting their eyebrows, like struggling to understand what you meant and asking all these follow-ups. They're going to say, oh, great, thank, and you can be much faster. And then I think if you're good at this skill, then turning around to your team, what matters much more than if you didn't understand this skill. And so I think you're much easier to guide and you focus the conversation in the right area. So you can kind of turn around and apply the knowledge in both directions. I think that works really well.
And what I would say for anyone in the world who's listening or watching this and thinking of building that skill, it's as much about the words you use as the thinking you do to distill the message, right? It's not just how do I get the clear words to communicate where the suppliers and the flour and all those things are. It's the thinking beforehand to actually clean up the mess so that someone else can see it clearly. And so don't assume it's all gravitas of your voice or the words that you use. A lot of times the message can be delivered in different formats, but if it's a clear, concise, well thought through, useful message,
Yep.
that can go much longer, much further for you, independent from how it's delivered.
Yeah, actually, you're making me think earlier when we talked about the not having time to kind of get the lay of the land and you might be overcommitted and not every leader gives themselves time. I'm going to take that idea and connect it to what you just said there, where, I'd had people complain to me before that they produced this synthesis and no one said anything, or like, that happens a lot in big organizations. You produce something and you don't quite, maybe didn't get on the agenda or whatever it is. And people would say, well, that was a waste because, no one looked at it. And I would try and reframe it and say like the act of attempting to synthesize your area itself was the value. Whether anyone looked at it or not should be at some level irrelevant, because it informed you better how to then drive your area of the business going forward. So think less about whether someone were able to congratulate you on a well-versed summary and think more about how great it was that you were given the time to step out of the fray and synthesize what was going on to better direct the area of your business.
Side note, this is making me think of another book I'm reading right now, which isn't explicitly a leadership book, but it's this book called Write Useful Books.
Okay.
And what it forces you to do is think about what you're distilling, think about how to communicate it in a way that lands and is useful, and to sort of iterate until you do that well. And it's funny, I think in a book you have to, because that book is going to go out and your message is going to go there without tone, without rapport. The message has to stand on its own. But I do think there's an amount of, just message crafting, right? Messaging that goes into good leadership that we don't always think about. Because again, we think about this, how do you stand in front of a room and have the presence in front of a room? But the messaging is also really important. And I think it's important for books too.
Yeah. And I like Patrick Lencioni's book, The Advantage, because it talks a lot about that communication cascade. And, even in active leadership is, if you have a leadership team meeting, in theory, you made decisions or something happened. And, how do you get the rest of your org on the same page? How do you communicate that back out? And kind of to your point, there is some, you have to condense that. Like, let's say you had a 3-hour discussion about some really important points. You can't record that meeting and have that make sense to anybody else, and they also won't have the time to listen to 3 hours of babble. So you got to like package that up, and being really good at crafting a message and communicating that is another key skill of leadership for sure.
Here's what's weird though, AI is doing that better and better.
Yeah.
Summarizing our thinking, listening to a conversation like this and then giving you back takeaways. It's remarkable that we could potentially use AI as at least as a first draft, right? I think we then have to think about it as humans, but
Well, I'm with you. That is a key area of opportunity, I guess, for the future, because leaders, like, I can say that intellectually with you and say, oh, it's very important to package your blah, but like, if you just had a 3-hour meeting, you don't have the time because you got to go to your next meeting and get on to the next problem. And so, it's one of those probably, if there's if the information summary is good and it doesn't cost you much in time, like, why not, do something like that as opposed to trying to continue to use your brain to write messages.
Well, worth it. Outsource the brain to AI when you can. And so, before we close, I wanted to think about areas that might be actionable, right? We've talked about the sort of the theory and the big picture, but if we can for a moment think about folks who are listening to this or watching this, who are thinking about what they can do to grow their leadership, to be a leader, to be a more effective leader. Any actionable things that come to mind for you that folks might take away and test out?
Yeah, I have one, and it relates to this idea of agency, and we didn't contrast leaders and managers. Sometimes that's a non-useful distinction, but often it can be. I think agency summarizes it well. And, I guess a way to frame it is, leaders are offer makers and managers are order takers. And, if that's true, then one act is to make offers. So where do you hear something going on that you can lean forward and say, hey, I can help in this area. You're demonstrating your agency. And so that is an interesting tactic for someone to go apply and start to, yeah, be an agent and make offers and see if they could take their organization in a better place.
Oh, that framing, that wording is so interesting, because when you say offer maker, I think sales,
Mhm.
And then I think to myself, I mean, to some extent, leadership is a little bit of selling. And so
Yeah.
there's a whole nother thread that could pull. It's funny, I was thinking about, we didn't even talk about self-awareness. Gosh, there's so many components to this topic. But for me, the self-awareness or the sort of situational awareness, if I was thinking for a leader, right, who's thinking right now, like, how do I grow as a leader? I was thinking that a quick assessment of yourself and your team might allow you to get an honest picture of where things are versus where they could be, right? And so an honest assessment of your team is your team delivering results on the things that matter most? And if not, where are the gaps happening? If you don't know what matters most, then that's a problem. If you've got 12 competing versions of what matters most, that's a problem, right? And so you can look at that as an effectiveness of, hey, am I helping folks all row the boat in the same agreed upon direction?
Yeah.
The other thing I would say as a leader that functionally you own, are people satisfied?
Mhm.
Are your employees and then your end customers for whatever you're building, but we'll talk here about just the leadership, the employees, are they happy, right? Are people frequently taking off work and taking time away and you sort of can't find them? If you can't hop on a call with them to check how they're doing and get an honest answer, if you see teams throwing these virtual daggers at one another, yeah, okay, folks may not be so happy and satisfied, and that's where perhaps your attention needs to go. And so I think if you as a leader can just check in honestly as you can on your org, are we delivering results? Are people reasonably happy when they're doing it? Those give you clues as to where you might be able to follow up from what you see. But the assessment is something that anyone could do today, right? To take 15 minutes and just take a look at themselves and their org.
Yes, they could. I'm going to make it one key point, which is you have to be willing to accept reality. And I think sometimes you can do an assessment and then ignore what it looks like. And one way to, part of that is, I guess, growth mindset versus fixed mindset a little bit. And, like maybe prime yourself to be in a more growth mindset mode when you do that. Maybe look back at the last however many years you've been working, contrast your capability and mindset today versus then, recognize you're on a trajectory and you want to continue that trajectory. So how do you be really open to the learning that you might get when you do an assessment so that you actually get the honest, real answers and do something meaningful with it, as opposed to using it as just an exercise. So you got to kind of prime yourself to be willing to see reality.
Well, and it's a great point that you both need that growth mindset and the humility. Also, sometimes you're biased, right? You see the things you want to see. And this is where I actually like coming in from outside of an org and doing either a performance 360 or almost like an org 360, right? Like, how healthy is your organization? Because sometimes an outsider can just come in and see that very quickly in a way that when you're in it, you may not be willing or able. And
Yep.
so whether you do that yourself or leverage someone else, right, depends on your own level of self-awareness, your humility, your growth mindset, your environmental awareness. And if you feel limited on those things, bring in someone to help, right? Because that
Yes.
can get you the clear visibility on where the gaps are.
Yeah, for sure. The fresh eyes perspective is really good. It's everyone's a fish in water. You have the dynamic you have, and maybe everyone sort of resign themselves to things being a certain way. But having someone come in and assess you as a leader or your org's effectiveness can be like, oh gosh, you're right. Like we forgot that that's true, and we were just so used to it. So that's a really good technique.
Anything else on leadership that you want to mention that we haven't covered?
You brought it up, I guess, to put a fine point on this around like there are two things leaders are predominantly accountable for, and that is the outcomes they produce and then the people that are in it. And if you get that balance off, you can get things to be a little wonky. If you over index on the goals, you might burn out everyone on the team. If you over index on the people, they might not produce the outcomes you're accountable for. And so that's a really interesting dichotomy of leadership, is the accountability versus compassion and finding the right balance between those two things. So I won't deep dive too much on it, just kind of pointing out that that's true, and you don't want to ignore one to the peril of the other. And it's also not something you like figure out and then are done. It's like you will constantly be challenged by changes in both the people and the outcomes, and you have to kind of figure out, does my team need a break? They're burnt out. We've been driving this so hard. Even though in theory the right thing to do might be to keep pushing forward, you're actually you're gonna fail on the people side. And then you might also think, especially early managers really think about being friends with the staff, and that's a noble, maybe mindset, but If you do that wrong, you might over-index on the compassion and not be able to produce outcomes, which is a hindrance to your own growth as a leader. So just thinking about those two things and getting them in balance and minding that is a really important thing.
I was looking at leadership topics and I went into Reddit, the subreddit on, I can't remember if this is on Reddit leadership or Reddit managers, but there was someone in there being like, don't make friends with your team. It's a terrible idea. So it was on that exact topic and saying, don't do it. It's funny. I think what you and I have done today, Kevin, and I think it might be because we're system thinkers, but we've given folks a lot of continua to examine, right? That accountability, compassion, continuum, that, where are you getting your information? How systematic is your thinking, right? All of these things are just areas to look at as a leader. And maybe that's overwhelming, right? To have these continuum. But I think for me, it's a little bit pleasant because it says, look, there's no one model here. There's no one textbook that could do this. If a textbook could do leadership, probably AI would already be doing it, right? And so the fact that this does vary a little bit and that you have to observe, where am I along these continua? Where is my org along these continua? How is the relationship between them and how can we improve that? There are so many different parameters to be aware of. And so I'll say first and foremost is this is hard. Being a leader is hard. Being an effective leader is hard. And so giving oneself grace in trying to do that as best as one can, recognizing we all have limitations, but then viewing this as a framework to examine those different levers that you can pull, those different continua that you can move along. I think it does give folks the permission of a lot of agency, a lot of flexibility in how they lead.